Good morning. Thank you so much for having me. I want to dive right in with a story, a somber story. It begins on September 15th, 1963, and it was the day of the Youth Day Sunday service at 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. Four little girls, Addie Mae Collins, Denise McNair, Carol Robertson, and Cynthia Wesley, were in the church basement. They were all putting final finishing touches on their white dresses before the Youth Day Sunday service, and that's when the bomb exploded. It left a hole in the floor 5 feet wide and 2 feet deep, killed all four girls, and decapitated poor Cynthia. Her parents could only tell it was their precious baby girl by the ring on her finger and the shoes on her feet. In the wake of this tragedy, this act of racial terrorism, of course, people were outraged, not even just in the US, but internationally. Even staunch segregationists expressed their dismay. But there was also, in the wake of this tragedy, a young white lawyer named Charles Morgan Jr. And he had been scheduled to give a talk in front of a business association in Birmingham, all white. And he changed his talk at the last minute. He asked his audience a series of questions. He said, "Who did it? Who threw that bomb? Was it a Negro or a white?" And he said, the answer should be, "We all did it." He said the who is every little individual who talks about the N-word and spreads the seeds of his hate to his neighbor and his son. The jokester, the crude oaf whose racial jokes rock the party with laughter. Then Charles Morgan Jr. turned his attention to the church and he asked, did those ministers visit the families of the Negroes in their hour of travail? Did many of them go to the homes of their brothers and express their regrets in person or pray with crying relatives? Do they admit Negroes into the ranks of their church? I begin my book, The Color of Compromise, with that story. Because what Charles Morgan Jr. is getting at is the idea of complicity. You see, too often we think about racism and racists in only the most extreme forms. It's the people who put on white robes and hoods and burn crosses. It's the people who hold the rope of the lyncher's noose. It's the people who plant dynamite and bomb churches. And if that's all racism is, if that's all racism looks like, then hardly anyone is racist. But it's not that simple. You see, in Birmingham, they already had earned the nickname Bombingham. There was already a neighborhood, a black neighborhood, nicknamed Dynamite Hill. So this wasn't the first time a bombing had happened. And what Charles Morgan Jr. is getting at, as he's speaking to his white audience, is that if they had acted sooner, if they had spoken up, if they had shown their concern more, perhaps those four girls would be alive. And so the idea of complicity is that it's not that every individual is out there committing these acts of racial terrorism. It's that by our silence, our apathy, our indifference, we can allow those things to happen. The truth is that the most egregious acts of racism can only occur within a context of compromise. And so the message today, the theme is truth-telling as healthy prophetic living. Truth-telling as healthy prophetic living. We know that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. And of course, when Jesus says he is the truth, he's talking about capital T truth, universal, eternal truth of the gospel. But there is also lowercase t truth. And if we are committed to capital T truth as Christians, we ought also to be committed to lowercase t truth, especially the truth about history, and especially the truth about U.S. racial history and Christianity. You know, I've studied a lot of our nation's history, and the unfortunate fact is that when it came to Christians, specifically white Christians, they were often on the wrong side of justice when it came to race. And so I want you to join me on this journey of truth, this journey of truth telling as healthy prophetic living. And what I want to do is convey to you three truths about compromise, three truths about U.S. racial history, three truths about Christians in the midst of it. The color of compromise is green. Green representing the greed of slaveholders and slave traders who put profit over people. The color of compromise is white for white supremacy, for a story that we tell about race that puts white people at the center of society and on top, and all other people at the margins or on the bottom. And the truth is, the color of compromise is red. Red for the violence involved in the greed and the white supremacy of racism. I'll talk about each of these in turn and end with a bit of a call to action. First, I want to thank the organizers of this event, and especially Dr. Nicholas Rowe for inviting me and all who made this happen. I also want to preface it by saying I'm taking a historical approach in this talk, so don't panic if you don't hear the word Jesus or hear me cite a Bible verse every other word. I'm approaching this mainly as a historian. There are other presentations I can do that focus more on the theology. And then also, this is the continuation, I hope, of a conversation. If you want to hear more of my thoughts, you can follow on social media at Jemar Tisby. Also, a couple of websites. You can go to jemartisby.com, and I would love for you to subscribe to my newsletter. That's also at jemartisby.com if you click on the link. Also, I host a podcast. I co-host it with Tyler Burns called Pass the Mic. It's available wherever you get your podcasts. And lastly, I am CEO of The Whiteness Inc., and you can visit thewitnessinc.com, thewitnessinc.com for more information. Now, on to our first point, that the color of compromise is green. I want to begin with a quote from James W.C. Pennington, who was a Black minister and abolitionist in the 1800s. And he said this: "The being of slavery, its soul and its body, lives and moves in the chattel principle, the property principle, the bill of sale principle, and the cart whip, starvation, and nakedness are all its inevitable consequences." You know, when it comes to slavery, we often say slavery for shorthand, but the full description is race-based chattel slavery. Race-based because very soon after European contact with North America, the system of slavery came about, and it was based on race that said if you are of African descent, you were automatically eligible and oftentimes born into enslavement, whereas if you were white, it was a different category altogether. But it's the chattel part that we often overlook. Chattel means property. You know, many people say that slavery was America's original sin. I think it might be more accurate to say that greed was America's original sin and slavery was America's original symptom. Think of it this way. In a capitalist system, your goal is to maximize profit and minimize loss. And if you've ever looked at a budget or some sort of pie graph that shows a budget, you know that the biggest slice of the pie is wages, salaries, and benefits to your employees. So if you want to cut costs, one of the quickest ways to do that is cut wages, salaries, and benefits to your employees, or even better yet, you don't pay them at all. For 2 centuries, that's what happened in race-based chattel slavery. The blood, sweat, and toil of enslaved Black people literally built the wealth of this country, and for it, we were compensated not a penny. I live in the Mississippi Delta region on the Arkansas side. If you look at the history, this region didn't really become known for slavery until about the 1820s, 1830s. That's because it was further west, inland from the East Coast, and because it was swampland, it was forest, it was marshland. Who cut down the trees? Who pulled up the roots? Who drained those swamps and marshes? Who cultivated the soil? Who planted the cotton? Who weeded the cotton? Who picked the cotton? Enslaved Black people. And they were not compensated. They were not paid wages. And this isn't to say that racism didn't exist before slavery. It is to say that one of the things that made race-based chattel slavery so resilient was there was money involved. There was profit to be had in enslaving people. And so racism and greed formed this toxic mixture that made it resilient. And never let anyone tell you that the Civil War was fought just over states' rights. You simply say, okay, but the state's right to do what? Enslave people. And one of the things I love about history is that you don't have to take my word for it. You can go to the primary sources. So if you look at the Articles of Secession that the state of Mississippi wrote, these are the stated reasons the legislature gave for separating from the Union. In the Mississippi Articles of Secession, published in January 1861, it said this: "Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery. The greatest material interest of the world, its labor, supplies the product, which constitutes by far the largest and most important portions of commerce of the earth." Do you hear the language of economics, of money? The greatest material interest of the world, its labor supplies the product, which constitutes the important commerce of the earth. There was money to be had. Race-based chattel slavery turns a person into property. That's why when you look at pictures of slave ships like this, people aren't put on board as passengers. That would require rooms and seats and comforts to make the voyage comfortable. That's not how enslaved Africans came to North America. They were packed on board not as people, but as property, not as people, but as cargo. You'll be familiar with this person, Frederick Douglass. Escaped from slavery, became probably the most outspoken abolitionist of the 19th century. And you may also be familiar with a quote from the appendix of one of his autobiographies. Thankfully, Black Christians were able to see the truth of the gospel in spite of slaveholders who claimed Christianity, but acted in contradiction of some of its most basic morals and ethics. And so Black Christians were able to see through the hypocrisy of white Christians who claimed to follow Christ, but also considered human beings made in the image of God nothing more than property to be owned, to be bought, to be sold, to be brutalized, to be raped, to be killed. Frederick Douglass said this. He said, "I love the pure, peaceable, and impartial Christianity of Christ. I therefore hate the corrupt, slave holding, women whipping, cradle plundering, partial, and hypocritical Christianity of this land. Indeed, I can see no reason but the most deceitful one for calling the religion of this land Christianity. I look upon it as the climax of all misnomers, the boldest of all frauds, and the grossest of all libels. I said we were going to talk about truth telling as healthy prophetic living. And so these are words of truth, but they're difficult truth and nonetheless accurate. And so we've got to grapple with the economic aspect of racism. And I say in the book, The Color of Compromise, that the only other R word more controversial than racism is the word reparations. Yes, reparations. I don't know how you feel about it, but consider this. For more than 2 centuries, Black people were not compensated for the labor that they gave that literally enriched the nation and slaveholders. And then even after the Civil War and emancipation, there was Field Order number 15 issued by General Sherman that allotted 40 acres per family in a region from the mid-Atlantic down to the northern parts of Florida. And yet that order was rescinded. And so that dream of 40 acres and a mule never came to fruition. Then you had a century of Jim Crow segregation. And what that meant was Black people were relegated most oftentimes to menial jobs. Many times would not be promoted to leadership positions because there was no way a Black person would have authority over a white person. Many unions which organized for better working conditions initially excluded Black people. You look at factors like the New Deal. Many of the New Deal benefits were withheld from Black people, especially in the South. You can move forward to World War II and following with the GI Bill. Many of those benefits were withheld from returning soldiers, which was critical at a time when a new middle class was forming in the United States. And we can go on and on and on up to the present day about the ways that Black people have not participated in benefiting from the wealth of this nation that they helped to create, such that in the present day, Pew Research shows that the median white family has 10 times the wealth of the median Black family. It shows that students, there's a disparate impact on loans for college tuition, that Black students take on 85% more debt than white students, and that we have to pay it back more slowly, that we are also targeted specifically by for-profit colleges, that we have a lack of historic family wealth to help us pay for school and pay off these debts. And so all I'm saying is whatever the mechanics look like, and by the way, there's a new book called Reparations coming out by 2 Christians, Duke Kwon and Greg Thompson. Whatever the mechanics of actually dispersing reparations, what I'm saying is we cannot have a serious conversation about racial justice unless we talk about economic justice as well. The color of compromise is green. But that's just the beginning, folks, the beginning of our truth telling. Here's where it gets really sticky for some, because you're going to hate these words. The color of compromise is white. One of the themes that I constantly bring forth is the idea that racism never goes away, it just adapts. And so if we look at the manifestations of racism, you can see 3 historical movements, 3 historical manifestations of racism: slavery, Jim Crow segregation, and what Emerson and Smith call in their book, Divided by Faith, a racialized society where all kinds of factors from health to wealth to education fall predictably along racial lines. And the question is, after a civil war, after a civil rights movement, after all of these efforts to fight racism, why are we still in this battle? Why are we still in this struggle? Why does racism just keep adapting in new social circumstances and cultural contexts? It's because what underlies racism is white supremacy, or as one author put it, the narrative of racial difference. And I appreciate that that description, the narrative of racial difference, because it's the story, it's the myth that we craft around race. And so, white supremacy is a tough phrase for some people to hear, but it simply means that in our society, many people presume that white is right, that whatever is common to white people is what is normal or standard or better than that which comes from Black people and other people of color. White supremacy creates this category of whiteness, the narrative of racial difference, and also creates this category of whiteness. Now, when people hear me say that term whiteness, oftentimes they hear me saying white people. It's not the same thing. When I say whiteness, I'm talking about an ideology or a belief or a set of practices, not white people. Let me quote theologian Willie James Jennings, who says, "My use of the term whiteness does not refer to people of European descent, but to a way of being in the world and seeing the world that forms cognitive and affective structures able to seduce people into its habitation and meaning making." Whiteness, a way of being in the world and seeing the world. And whiteness seduces because it has several effects. Number one, it obscures ethnicity. And this is mainly for white people. You see, at one point in your history, you weren't white. Your ancestors were German or Italian or Swedish or British or whatever it might be. When they crossed the Atlantic and came to North America, specifically the United States, they became white. And what happened was there is a currency to whiteness in a white supremacist society. In other words, it gives you certain advantages. You can get jobs, own property, vote, all these kinds of things. But in exchange, you give up that ethnic heritage. You give up the language, the dances, the food culture, the history, and all you have to cling to as far as a sort of racial national identity is whiteness. But that's problematic because the other impact of whiteness is that it creates this opposite and inferior category of blackness. Creates this opposite and inferior category of blackness. The narrative of racial difference or white supremacy says that people of African descent have inherently less dignity, less worth, less ability, and less of everything than white people. And the ways that it manifests is subtle. And so when I was in seminary, all of my classes were just theology classes until they were Black theology or Latin American theology or Asian theology. In other words, Black people and people of color had to be labeled. If it was a theology or a teaching coming out of European or white spaces, it was just theology because it was considered normal, standard, and in most cases, superior. So when you cling to whiteness, you necessarily cling to anti-Blackness or this idea of inferiority of Black people and people of color. So what would it look like for white people to recover a sense of their national and ethnic heritage over and above simply being white? What would it look like to go back and understand where your ancestors came from, how they lived, and having that as part of your narrative of identity? Now, what does all this have to do with truth telling? What does all this have to do with Christian being complicit in racism? Well, most people don't realize that the Ku Klux Klan wasn't just one continuous movement, it had three major waves. The first was right after the Civil War to reinscribe white supremacy after emancipation. The third wave was during the Civil Rights Movement to push back against the pursuit of Black civil rights. But the second wave which came during the Jim Crow era, was in many ways the most widespread and violent wave. And it was initiated on Thanksgiving Day in 1915 by a white preacher, Methodist preacher named William J. Simmons. He got a group of his white friends, all men, to go to the top of Stone Mountain, Georgia, which has the Confederate heroes Stonewall Jackson, Jefferson Davis, and Robert E. Lee etched on the front. They went to the top of Stone Mountain, Georgia, and they did a couple of things. Number one, they burned a cross, which would become, of course, a symbol of white racial terrorism throughout the Jim Crow era. And the other thing they did was they built an altar, and on top of it, they placed a Bible and an American flag. That Bible was open to a passage in Romans that, among other things, states, "Be devoted to one another in love." What we see here is this mix of race, religion, and a perverted form of patriotism. Race, because it was just white people up there. There were no black people invited to this gathering, and they were never going to be, except as victims. Religion, because you have these Christian symbols, the cross, the altar, the Bible, and patriotism, which we could call nationalism, with symbolized by the American flag. And of course, we see the ripple effects on into the present day. We would call it nowadays Christian nationalism, which I believe is the greatest threat to the witness of the gospel in the United States today. Christian nationalism. What is it? Samuel Perry and Andrew Whitehead, in their book, Taking America Back for God, define Christian nationalism as an ideology that idealizes and advocates a fusion of Christianity with American civic belonging and participation. They go on to explain that Christian, in this sense, represents more of an ethno-cultural political identity, that denotes a specific constellation of religious affiliation, typically evangelical Protestant, but also including Catholic and mainline as well. Cultural values, politically, socially conservative, race, white, and nationality, an American-born citizen as opposed to an immigrant. That constitutes Christian nationalism, but what does Christian nationalism actually look like? It looks like the American flag in pulpits at churches. It looks like pictures of a European looking Jesus hovering over the White House when a certain president was elected, if you saw that online. It looks like massive celebrations of the 4th of July and Independence Day at churches. It looks like revering the Constitution as an almost religious and divinely inspired document. This goes beyond patriotism. It conflates God and country, God and political conservatism. It mixes up the fate of the church with the fate of the nation. But it's important to remember that Jesus said, "I will build the church, not I will build this country." And so we must watch out for white Christian nationalism. And the truth, as we tell the truth, is that the color of compromise is white. The color of compromise is also red. A moment ago, I mentioned two effects of white supremacy: that it erases ethnicity and that it creates this equal and opposite category of blackness. But there's one more effect of white supremacy. White supremacy says that in order to maintain power, in order to maintain control, violence is necessary. I want to read to you a quote from Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, Between the World and Me. It says this: "It's hard to face this, but all your phrasing, race relations, racial chasm, racial justice, racial profiling, white privilege, even white supremacy, serves to obscure that racism is a visceral experience, that it dislodges brains, blocks airways, rips muscle, extracts organs, cracks bones, breaks teeth. And you must never look away from this. You must always remember that the sociology, the history, the economics, the graphs, the charts, the regressions all land with great violence upon the body. That's why you'll often hear activists today talk in these terms, black bodies, and why you can almost say, why aren't you saying black people? It's black bodies, because it is our very embodied selves being enfleshed in this brown skin that is the problem for white supremacy. This is our physical selves. And when we experience this, you know, the image of God can be defaced, but it can never be erased. And so Black people and other people of color, we have this internal sense, which I believe is the fingerprint of God upon us, that we shouldn't be treated this way, that just because we look different, it doesn't mean we're inferior or someone else is superior. And so we begin to rise up against our own oppression, but white supremacy doesn't go down without a fight. And so when Black people have risen up in this country, there's always a backlash and a pressing down of that rising up for justice. And oftentimes it requires violence. And so I want to tell you about a lynching. And I do not do this with any amount of pleasure. I do it because too often we look away from the gruesomeness and the bloodiness of racism and white supremacy. I want to tell you about Luther and Mary Holbert and the way they were lynched. It was 1904 in Sunflower County. This is during the Jim Crow era in Mississippi. There was a Black man named Luther Holbert who was in a relationship with a woman named Mary, but it was a bit of a love triangle. There was another Black sharecropper, and he and Luther were getting into it. Finally, it had reached such a point of contention that this other Black sharecropper went and got the white plantation owner, and they went to Luther Holbert's cabin. Now, as is typical in these cases, we don't know exactly what went down, but perhaps in an act of self-defense, Luther Holbert got his gun and shot both the Black sharecropper and the white plantation owner. Now, we know the way white supremacy works. If Luther had killed just the Black sharecropper, he might have gone to prison, been fired, something of that nature. But since he killed a white man, and not just any white man, a wealthy white man, it was a virtual death sentence from the start. So Luther gets Mary, and together they go on the run, and they hide out for 3 days in swamps, and Mary even disguises herself as a man, but the bloodhounds and the posse eventually catch up to them. And they didn't lynch them right away on the spot. They waited until a particular day, a Sunday, the Lord's Day, the Sabbath. Why? So more people could come out. Ultimately, 1,000 people came out to view this gruesome spectacle. And they chose their location strategically. They didn't just go any place. They chose the grounds of a Black church to strike fear in the hearts of people. And the torture was slow and horrifying. First, they cut off their fingers and their toes and handed them out as souvenirs. They beat Luther and Mary so mercilessly that one of Luther's eyes hung from its socket. And then they used a large corkscrew. It said they bored it into the flesh of the man and woman in the arms, legs, and body, and then pulled out spirals, tearing out big pieces of raw, quivering flesh every time it was withdrawn. And finally, the Holberts, who were still alive, were dragged to the fires. They burned Mary first so Luther could see his beloved killed before his very eyes. And then they burned him. Today is the anniversary of the murder of Trayvon Martin, February 26th, 2012. And even in the 21st century, we are still dealing with the dehumanization and the brutalization of Black people. And it was in the wake of the acquittal of Trayvon Martin's killer that the phrase Black Lives Matter was formed and the movement began. And on a theological level, Black Lives Matter is an assertion of the image of God in Black people. It's saying that Black people don't matter more than anyone else, but that we matter just as much as anyone else because we too are made in the image of God. Brothers and sisters, we must respond then to these truths. We must respond with what Martin Luther King Jr. called the fierce urgency of now. And so my second book, How to Fight Racism, uses something called the arc of racial justice, and it stands for awareness, relationships, commitment. I wish I had time to go into further detail about it, but I believe we need each of these components, awareness, relationships, and commitment, to have a holistic approach to justice. But in the final sum, when it comes to fighting racism and telling the truth about it, I don't believe we have a how-to problem. I believe we have a want-to problem. And so the question I leave us with as we tell the truth for healthy prophetic living is not how will you fight racism, but will you fight it? Thank you.